Welcome to SWILHELM'S Horror. We are a growing channel dedicated to bringing you the scariest stories that we're able to get our hands on. So if you enjoy that type of content and like hearing true stories that are guaranteed to send a chill up your spine, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to our channel. And also be sure to hit that notification bell as we plan on uploading 2 or more times per week. Robert and Miranda Sabini were a couple who, despite being recently married, had been together for almost a decade. The two had a 6-year-old son named Ian, who was typically very social and overall just loved to get attention. After Robert had received a promotion at the security company that he had worked for, where he was to become a leading security officer of the night shift at a lumber yard in a small town in Illinois, this meant that he and his family were going to relocate soon. They ended up finding this small cabin near town and close to Robert's job. It was affordable and well within their price range, so it seemed like a no-brainer. On the weekends, they could enjoy the scenic views in the woods, and it wouldn't break the bank either. And on the outside, everything about the cabin seemed perfect. It was 2 bedrooms and had a pretty big yard, so they knew Ian would have a lot of fun playing. Once they moved in, everything else settled pretty quickly. Robert was getting into the groove at his new job, Miranda, who did online tutoring from home, was back on track with her students, and Ian seemed to be enjoying himself, for the most part at least. It wasn't too long before Ian's parents began to notice that he was acting a little bit odd. He was a lot quieter than he usually was, and he just seemed uneasy about something. So one day, while they were all eating dinner, Miranda decided to ask Ian if everything was all right, and Robert assured him that he could talk to them about anything. And what Ian told them had Robert and Miranda really confused. Ian said that for the past couple of nights, when he looked out his window before bed, he could see something in the woods staring back at him. And to his parents, this could only mean one or two things. Either Ian has a really strong imagination that's coming back to haunt him, or there really was something out there watching their kid sleep. After dinner, the three loaded up into their SUV and drove to the closest Walmart, which was about a half-hour away. They didn't want to worry their son, so they just told him that they were going to get some snacks and a DVD so they could have a movie night, which made Ian happy. But really their goal was to get a security camera for their new home. One for the front of the house and one for the back of the house. Then they would get a third for the living room. That way, if anything was to actually happen, they could be ready. So after they got home, they watched the movie, then Miranda and Ian went to bed while Robert began setting up the cameras around the house. Once they were all plugged in, they just hooked up to an app on his cell phone and they were ready to go. Once Robert made sure that they were all up and running, he then joined Miranda and went to sleep. The next day, the two couldn't wait for Ian to wake up to ask him if anything had happened, so instead they just decided to watch the camera footage. And at first, they both thought that nothing was strange, but then Miranda gasped. Robert was confused because he still didn't quite see anything, but he believed that his wife might have. Miranda would then swear that she could see the reflection of eyes in the tree line. But Robert tried to convince her that this was just a blur on the camera and that the trees were way too far away for a cheap camera like that to catch it. After Ian woke up and ate his breakfast, his parents decided to finally ask him, "Did anything happen last night? Did you see anything outside your window?" And without hesitating, Ian said yeah. He saw exactly what he had been seeing for the past few nights. Robert, still believing that what he saw on his phone was just a blur on the camera, told his wife that everything was fine and that there was nothing to worry about, and although by looking at her, he could tell how worried she was, he figured it really was nothing, just some new house jitters. Later that night, the time came for Robert to go to work, and Miranda was a bit concerned that she would be in the house by herself, but overall, she figured she could just make sure to lock every door and close every blind in the cabin, especially the one in her son's room, and everything would be fine. That night went normally. Robert went to work, Ian and Miranda had dinner, everything went fine. Ian eventually went to sleep, but Miranda's mind wouldn't let her. After a few hours, though, she could finally feel her eyes getting heavier and heavier and decided it was time to go to bed. But before going to sleep, she wanted to check on Ian one more time, just to make sure everything was okay. When she opened the door to his room, she was more than happy to see that he was sound asleep in his bed. However, all that changed when she looked over to the window. When she looked over to the window, From the doorway, she could tell that, though the curtains had been drawn shut, just as she had done earlier, there was something causing them to blow, as if a breeze was coming in. But this was strange because Miranda made sure that the window was shut and locked before closing everything up. So, despite hesitating for a second, she slowly made her way across the room, hoping that it was just a draft. But when she began to part the curtains, her worst nightmare became a reality. She could tell that the window was wide open. As fast as she could, she opened the blinds and slammed the window shut and locked the small latch on top of it. And if the slamming of the window didn't wake Ian up, his mother's scream would. Standing not in the tree line, but right in the middle of their yard, was a grown man looking right at the window. Miranda screamed and pulled the curtain shut and grabbed her son, who was now wide awake. The two ran into her room and into the bathroom that was attached to it. Miranda slammed the door and locked it, and immediately began to call the police. As soon as she hung up the phone with them, she phoned her husband immediately. He rushed back to his home, all while keeping Miranda on the line to make sure that her and their son was safe. By the time he got there, the police were right behind him, but sadly, whoever had been standing in the yard and opened their son's window was long gone. This time, though, when Robert, Miranda, and the police reviewed the security footage that they could see on Robert's phone, you could clearly make out a person who appeared to be a grown man walk from the tree line of the woods right up to Ian's window, mess with something, and then start turning back towards the woods. But about halfway as he walked through the yard, he turned back to look at the window, which he stared at for a minute, and then sprinted back into the trees. It's believed that when he turned around, it was because he heard Miranda messing with the curtains after checking in on her son. The couple quickly agreed that it was too dangerous to stay there, and they decided to put the cabin up for sale. And during the year that they waited for someone to buy it, they managed to stay in a slightly smaller 2-bedroom apartment. And before finalizing the sale, the two made sure to let the buyers know what happened to them and told them that they could keep the cameras they had set up just in case they needed them. Stephen Hetcherson was a 14-year-old kid who grew up in a small town outside of Boulder, Colorado. He was the only child to Travis and Courtney Hetcherson, and though their family was small, they were very close. Both Courtney and Travis were often referred to as overprotective when it came to their son, and people would often call them helicopter parents because wherever he was, you just knew that they were hovering around him. Stephen had just turned 14, and his parents had finally agreed to let him spend a weekend by himself in the cabin that the family had owned. Stephen had gone to this cabin at least a dozen times in his life, but never by himself. So he was super excited, to say the least. I mean, to him, he saw it as his first steps of, actually growing up. So the night before the big weekend, Stephen's mom took him to the grocery store and let him pick out anything he wanted, snacks and meals that he'd be able to cook on the stove, like top ramen. After getting all the supplies together, the family returned home and they began packing up so Stephen would be able to bring what he needs on his trip. They were going to let him use his mom's cell phone for the weekend in case anything had happened, he'd be able to get in contact with his family. And after everything was said and done, the family went to sleep and prepared for their trip to the cabin the next day, which was only about an hour away by car. Stephen was up bright and early and made sure his parents were ready to hit the road as soon as the clock hit 10 a.m. And that's what happened. The Hetchersons hit the road, and in no time, Stephen could start seeing familiar landmarks that told him where they were, which was only about a few minutes away from the cabin. And sure enough, they got to their destination without any hiccups, and as Stephen and Courtney began to get their things out of the back of the car, Travis decided it was his job to go unlock the cabin. He went inside ahead of the family to make sure that there was nothing there out of the ordinary, no one wanted visitors, such as squirrels or raccoons that might have gotten in while they hadn't been there. And once he saw everything was fine, he was quick to get back outside and help his wife and son unload the few things that Stephen had brought with him for the weekend. And after they got everything unpacked and double-checked that he was all set and ready, Travis and Courtney left their son alone for the weekend for the very first time ever. Courtney would later say that as she left the cabin, she felt that there was something wrong in her gut and that this wasn't a good idea. And every day that goes by, she wishes that she had listened to it. After making it back to their house, Courtney and Travis were anxious to hear from their son, but they figured it might be too soon to call. They wanted him to know that they trusted him, but they couldn't help but worry. So Travis decided to do the next best thing, and he simply sent him a text saying, "Hey bud, I hope everything's okay." And that was that. To which their son ended up replying just a few minutes later, and he would let them know that everything was going fine, and he was enjoying himself. It was great. So Courtney and Travis got to relax, and the plan was that their son was going to call them after dinner. A few hours passed, and the two parents had just finished eating dinner themselves when Travis received a call from Stephen, just like they said they would. He put the phone on speaker so that both of the parents could talk to their son, and honestly, it seemed like everything was going fine. After talking for a minute, Courtney decided that it was time to get ready for bed, so she said her goodnights to her son and left Travis to finish talking to him for a minute before he too joined her to sleep. So, as he spoke with his son, he asked him the basic things like what he had for dinner, what he had been doing that day, and then he could hear Stephen's voice suddenly tense up a little bit. "Dad, I think I heard something outside." Travis was quick to try and calm his son down, and told his son that it was probably just an animal or something. I mean, after all, he was in the middle of the woods. He told Stephen to double check that the door was locked and that he would stay on the phone with him until he made sure that everything was okay. Stephen went and confirmed that the door was locked, and began to calm down a little after remembering exactly where he was, which was in the middle of the woods. It most likely was just an animal. He apologized to his dad for making him worry, and then decided that, you know what, it might be time for him to get to bed too. But first, he had to go around the cabin and make sure that all the curtains on every window were drawn closed, and that all the windows were locked, just to make himself feel a little bit safer. So, while still on the phone with his father, Stephen began walking around the cabin, checking each and every window in the living room, and began pulling the blinds shut. As he walked through the house, everything seemed fine. That was, until he walked to the back of the cabin. In the back of the cabin was the back room where Stephen was planning on staying that night. It was the master bedroom. As he walked into the back room of the cabin, where he was planning on sleeping, he was getting ready to say goodnight to his father, when all of a sudden Travis heard his son let out a blood-curdling scream. This was a scream that Travis would never forget. "What is it? What's going on? Stephen, are you okay?" Travis asked. And to his horror, Stephen responded by saying, "There's a man outside my window. Dad, help me, there's someone outside." Travis froze. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to hang up the phone, but he was an hour away from the cabin, and he knew that he had to call someone to get help. So he told his son, "Stephen, I need you to try to find some place to hide. I'm going to call the police. Please don't worry. Mom and Dad are on their way. You're going to be okay." And then he did the hardest thing that he would ever have to do in his life. He hung up on his crying son. Travis immediately notified the police in the area, and he and Courtney got in their car and raced to the cabin as fast as they could. By the time they got there, the place was surrounded by a row of cop cars that lined the entire driveway. But Stephen was nowhere to be found. The police said that by the time they got there, the door had already been opened, but from the inside. As they looked through the house, they discovered that the window in the back bedroom had been smashed open from the outside inward. Therefore, it's suspected that whoever it was broke in through the window, struggled with Stephen, grabbed him, and then unlocked the front door and walked right out. As it would turn out, Stephen was one of multiple abductions to happen in that area in 2004. As of right now, police in the area have no idea about the person involved in the kidnappings, and they haven't been able to locate any one of the children who had been taken. After about 2 years, Stephen's mother and father ended up holding a funeral for him in order to bring themselves some sort of closure. As of right now, it's still unclear what happened to Stephen. After a long week of making sales calls at the local call center, 29-year-old Dante Shepard decided that he deserved some time to himself so that he could unwind. He had saved up a few of his paid days off, so he decided to cash in 2 of them, one on a Friday and the other on the following Monday, so that he could give himself a 4-day weekend, during which he was planning on taking a trip up to his uncle's cabin, one that his uncle rarely used, but one that he loved just the same, and he enjoyed it when his family would stop by because that meant his uncle, the owner, wouldn't have to go up and check on the place as often because the family was there. They could notify him if something was wrong. Dante made sure to get a good night's sleep on Thursday because his plan was to get up around 3 in the morning and hit the road by 4. It was about a 4-hour drive for Dante to get to the cabin, but it was a drive that he made many times before. So when the time came, everything went off without a hitch. There wasn't much traffic, the weather was great, and Dante was at his uncle's cabin in what felt like no time at all. When he arrived at the 2-bedroom log cabin, Dante began unloading his supplies and food for the weekend. And as he was putting his perishables into the fridge, he noticed that there were 2 dirty plates in the sink. This confused him a bit, but at the end of the day, he just assumed that it was another family member. Someone must have visited the cabin and forgot to clean up. No big deal. Dante quickly washed the dishes, and then, he finished unpacking his food. And after getting all settled in, he figured that he would go for a quick walk through the woods and begin his weekend off the grid. The trail that Dante took was about a 2-mile walk round trip, and it was one of the more cleared out trails around the cabin. The rest were all noticeable trails, but often were slightly overgrown with brush and whatnot, so they weren't usually walked on. After enjoying nature for a bit, he found his way back to the cabin, and it was about time to have a late lunch. He was just going to throw together a nice sandwich for himself, with some cold cuts that he had brought and some nice bread, but when he got to the fridge, he noticed something was a little weird. The fridge had been left cracked open, even though he could have sworn that he closed it. But once again, he just decided to brush it off. Maybe he didn't close it all the way. So he began to assemble his sandwich together, and, he was feeling pretty hungry at this point, so he was pretty excited. Then all of a sudden, Dante felt a chill run up the back of his spine. He could feel all the hair on the back of his neck stand up. It was like something was watching him. And once again, he tried to just shake the strange feeling away, but this time he couldn't. He couldn't even eat his sandwich because he was so overwhelmed by this uncomfortable feeling. So Dante figured he would give his uncle a call, and maybe he could explain what was going on and put his mind at ease. And sure enough, when he spoke to his uncle and mentioned the weird things and the dishes in the sink, his uncle was able to ease his mind a little bit. He let Dante know that his cousin had actually visited the cabin a week earlier, so the dishes were likely just left from him and his wife. They must have forgot to clean before going. It was nothing for Dante to worry about. This information was great news, and it helped Dante calm down a lot, and he was actually able to eat his lunch. Afterwards, he decided to pull out one of the books that he had brought for himself to read, and he settled down for a bit. The rest of the day was fairly uneventful. He just read his book and had some dinner before going outside for a small fire. It was at this point that, he was still a little on edge from that feeling that he had gotten earlier, but he figured it was nothing. His uncle was probably right. It was just his cousin, and it was time for him to lay down and go to sleep. Dante made sure that the fire was out completely, got all of his things together, and headed inside. Once he was back in the cabin, he went to the bathroom and got ready for bed. Most of the family members who stayed in the cabin liked to stay in the master bedroom, but seeing as how he spent so much time in the smaller bedroom, that was the place that Dante was just much more comfortable, so he preferred to sleep in there. The room had a window which looked out into the driveway, but it was too dark to see anything. It also had a full-sized bed that took up most of the floor space, considering it was a small room, but there was room for storage in the form of a small crawl-space-style loft above the door. Dante got into bed and got ready to go to sleep, and just as he was about to get there, he got that feeling again. There was just no way to explain it, but he knew that there was something watching him. While his eyes were closed, he tried telling himself that it was probably an animal outside, and that he should just close the curtains and everything would be fine. But when he opened his eyes, he had to try with all his might not to scream. As soon as his eyes shot open, he noticed, up in the loft above him, the reflection of light bouncing off of 2 wide-open eyes that were just peering down at him. Dante did everything that he could to pretend like he didn't notice them. He was frozen with fear, but he knew he had to get out of the situation, and he knew he had to do it quickly. So he acted like he just had to use the bathroom. He got up, he made his way out into the hallway, and once inside, he made sure he had his phone and locked the door. Dante turned the shower on in hopes that he could make the intruder, whoever it may be, believe that he was showering, all the while he was sneaking out of the bathroom window. Once he was outside, Dante made his way to his car as fast as he could, and he locked the doors. He didn't want to start the car and risk the person inside the cabin hearing him, so he just sat there and called 911. As he was on the phone with the operator, Dante could see the silhouette of someone walking around the bedroom that he was supposed to be sleeping in. So Dante did his best to keep himself out of sight until the police arrived. As they made their way up the long driveway to the cabin with their lights flashing, whoever was inside must have seen. A woman came bolting out of the front door and attempted to run. Lucky for Dante, though, the police were faster. They managed to apprehend her and afterwards identify her. It was discovered that she was a 48-year-old homeless woman who had a substance abuse problem. She was very open about staying in the cabin for the past few months because she thought it had been abandoned. This was very alarming for Dante and his family, because finding out that she had been staying there for months meant that she had stayed there while family was there. She was not only there the time that Dante's cousin and his wife were there earlier in the week, but she was also there just a few weeks prior when Dante stayed there, just watching him, and no one was the wiser.